Good afternoon, and thank you all for everyone being here. Welcome to this virtual space convened by UC Berkeley's Cannabis Research Center. My name is Michael Polson. I'm an anthropologist and research scientist in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley, where I'm also the director of the Cannabis Research Center. For those of you who don't know, the Cannabis Research Center has been around since 2017. And since then, we've been studying issues related to cannabis agriculture, the environment, and local land use policy. I invite you to check out our website at crc.berkeley.edu to view our past webinars and future events and read our reports. You can also sign up for our newsletter that we'll be linking to in the chat. And if any of you need to do it more manually, you can just go to crc.berkeley.edu, and at the bottom of the page, there's a contact form where you can sign up for the newsletter there. So today, we're excited to host the second conversation in our California Research Conversation Series, where we'll be interviewing and talking with California cannabis researchers about their work and invite our audience to ask questions and explore those topics in depth. As many of you know, we have a yearly annual briefing where we're able to kind of report on the work that we do at Berkeley, but we also wanted to take more of an opportunity to knit together a lot of the folks from around the state. This conversation series will take place virtually every other Friday throughout the fall and spring. And we're including our link tree in the chat so you can register for future events like. We're thrilled to welcome Dr. Robert Chlala of Cal State Long Beach and UCLA's Workers Center. I met Rob at an anthropology conference in 2015 and very much appreciated his approach to cannabis that was not only theoretically informed and critical, but also oriented toward the political ramifications of the work that he was doing. Since then, Rob and I have corresponded and strategized about our research involvements, and it's always been a rewarding and instructive engagement. I'm excited to say that we're finally working on a project together on monopolistic and anti-competitive dynamics that we're just meeting about in the cannabis industry that has some really exciting global horizons, which Rob has made happen through his engaged scholarship and advocacy. One more reminder and then some notes on technical details. In case anybody's not muted, please stay muted until we call on you towards the end of the program. Before we jump in, though, I wanted to let you know about the format of this meeting. This discussion will last for an hour, ending promptly at 1 p.m. And we're going to start with an overview of the research, followed by some prepared questions. And at the end, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. So please remain on mute unless you're prompted to ask a question. But as we move through the discussion, as Rob and I are talking, please, if you're beginning to articulate those questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So then we can call on you if you want to read it or kind of articulate it in a different way. So when we get to the Q&A portion, I'm going to select the questions to be answered. We'll get through as many as we can. And you can also unmute yourself to ask the question if you like. So please note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website after. We'll have a nice little cache of talks from researchers around California doing topics germane to the Cannabis Research Center. So thanks, Dr. Chlala, Rob, for being here. I was wondering if we could just start with you telling us a bit about your research trajectory and engaged work around cannabis, and also your current role at Cal State Long Beach and UCLA.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael, for this opportunity. Thank you, Joanna, for all the behind the scenes work. Thanks, everyone, for spending a Friday afternoon in conversation. Yeah, it's been exciting to actually finally be able to collaborate directly with Michael after actually being inspired to pursue my work in part by some of the early work that he wrote about actually linking political economy strongly to cannabis, which has been, a big thread in what I do. But before I start, I just really, anytime I talk about this work, anytime I talk about what we're doing collaboratively in all of these projects, I really do want to take time to acknowledge the fact that We're talking about the war on drugs. We're talking about criminalization. We're talking about the loss of livelihoods for millions of people and the loss of lives directly through the mass incarceration system and the policing of cannabis and other drugs globally. So I just want to acknowledge those lives lost, the paths that people set to actually get us to this point where we can even have conversations about what a more just industry looks like, because we could even say this, talk about this as a quote industry or as a set of relationships 10, 15 years ago. And there was tremendous organizing and work that went into that, and tremendous loss and creation. um, and I also, cannot be publicly speaking these days without also acknowledging the ongoing genocide in Palestine and the wars in Lebanon, which play really closely to why I even began this work, being from Lebanon and thinking about the kind of thread that connects both of those questions is actually we have these ideas about what keeps us safe in this world, or we've been told them, and increasingly we've been told that they come at the end of a gun and through military violence and police violence, and that really the ways in which we actually keep each other safe and create a more sustainable world is often in these kind of lost spaces, these spaces that are informalized, rendered underground, like cannabis. And having grown up in communities where cannabis was criminalized, but also a source of medicine, a source of safety, from Inglewood to the rural communities of Northern California, I wanted to actually be able to find space to pursue that story, and went back to school after organizing to think about how I could collaboratively work with organizations to tell those stories that were being lost. Um, and so, yeah, that's where I started. And it started with experiences of workers, starting doing ethnographic and engaged research, working closely, particularly with the unionization movement in Los Angeles, which was the fastest growing union movement you had never heard of at the time, starting in the medical cannabis days in like 2013, 14. And so that project eventually blossomed thanks to the relationships and people that I met in those spaces into what is now the Cannabis Worker Collaborative Project, funded initially by the Department of Cannabis Control Research to create the very first California Cannabis Worker Survey. And every one of the projects I'm talking about is a fully collaborative enterprise. It's a enterprise that belongs as much to our community partners, in the case of the Cannabis Worker Collaborative Union and social equity and abolition groups, but also to each and every one of the team members from the community, worker researchers who made this possible, which I'll talk about at some point. And that blossomed into the project I'm going to talk a lot about today, so I won't talk too much about that. But now jumping from the UCLA Labor Center after finishing my PhD, I was able to find a wonderful position as an assistant professor at Cal State Long Beach, which allows me to actually also provide more direct paths of training and research opportunities for working class students of color at the Cal State system, which doesn't often have the funding or space to do kind of engaged research opportunities. So out of that, this new collaboration has come with Michael and with Doctors Delar Uskup, Jesse Goldstein, Nathan Sayre, and others who are increasingly growing team, which is always that seems to be the way to do it these days. Working on understanding monopoly tendencies, and then a global crew of folks, Kojo Karam, Paulo Pereira, Mariana Henderveles, Siobhan Holmes, and a bunch of other people who I'm missing, who are thinking about how do we link this kind of model of work, because it's actually been really amazing to me in the cannabis space. There are many of us who are thinking, maybe it's because of the nature of the work, maybe it's because of the people we meet, maybe it's because of the political orientation, but thinking really about how do you do engaged work from day one? How do you not just talk about and extract from communities, but actually work with them to think about what are the problems they're confronting around this now global trend towards legalization, but also consolidation and corporatization. And how do we come up with joint solutions, share information across boundaries? And so that's an ongoing, very long-term project and collaboration among all these folks, including the CRC, about how do we share that information so that we can get ahead of corporatization in some places, and then also understand that it's never just contained, as much as this is a state research grant, or we want to talk about the California cannabis industry as a closed box or workers' experience as a closed block, they're always interconnected and global.
Thanks so
That's
much.
yeah.
Yeah, great overview. I would love to dive just straight into the project that you've been doing and working on for the last several years, and to understand. I know it's coming closer to fruition, and it would be wonderful if you could just take us through some of the key findings that you think are in formation right now, and maybe with an eye particularly towards anything you found surprising, or new that maybe you didn't quite expect on the front end.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the California Cannabis Worker Survey is kind of the first opportunity that we had to try to get real hard facts, figures, and numbers around who California cannabis workers are. And so we surveyed more than 1,111 workers throughout the state in a model that was really, and this is kind of relevant for what we'll talk about in a second, but model that was driven with collaboration of worker researchers. More than 150 questions. Not everyone got all the 150 questions, but they covered everything from how you got started in the industry to what it's like on the day to day, and to what do you aspire to see in the industry. In-depth conversations and interviews, as well as in-depth conversations even in the survey process. And then we followed up with even more in-depth interviews that ranged anywhere from an hour to 4 hours, with more than 50 workers across the state. So we covered both folks working in the regulated sector and the unregulated sector, in order to understand the range of experiences. We tapped more folks in the regulated sector, but wanted to make sure we also covered that, because there are a lot of ideas about who those folks are and what those experiences are, which in the media and in policymakers' eyes. And so, yeah, so I think big picture findings, and again, the kind of just so folks have an understanding, we'll be releasing this officially in January around a larger conversation on worker equity. And we'll have other releases throughout that. And we've talked in some spaces along the way through other worker sessions. So some of the big kind of, I think one thing for me as somebody who went really deep into ethnographic work in Los Angeles with workers, working alongside workers, working myself in the industry, is that was wondering how fast those experiences held across the state. Like, is there really any similarity among worker experiences in the Emerald Triangle in San Diego and LA? And one of the things that just consistently, and sometimes I have to check myself, because having been rooted in these industries, hearing people's stories, you're like, am I romanticizing people's experiences? And one thing that just was confirmed again and again is that when you ask people, why do you stay in the industry? The two kind of main threads of it, besides an income, which we all need, are the people and the plant. So the people being their coworkers, patients, people they work with day to day, and then the plant being the relationship to the plant itself. So for folks working in cultivation, understanding that plant, understanding the medicine behind it, understanding the science. And so that was just reaffirmed again and again. And it's something that you have in the back of your head, and to see that many people say that and have many other options, trust me, in which we had really long survey questions where you could have gone so many directions, but constantly grounded and reaffirmed, was like really powerful. And then again in the worker sessions, because what we did is we took these into sessions that we'll talk about, to make sure like what's really resonating with you, what's out of left field, what seems like we made this up. And so again and again, people stuck with that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there's not a mass amount of challenges, right? So one of the things that also stuck out was just how much, particularly I think COVID experiences during COVID and post-COVID have changed the relationships on the ground with consumers, customers, patients, in the sense of people reporting and experiencing much more combative relationships with patients, especially during the masking era, people having altercations, being physically abused, yelled at, dealing with that, tensions appearing in that way, and then also from management, from vendors. Um, and that relationship, I think, being really strained. And so a lot of the tensions with an industry that's changing, get worked out on the shop floor or on the cultivation floor. And so that was something that came up frequently. A lot of reports of racial slurs, gendered violence, sexual harassment, which I think is probably one of the more familiar stories, but again, affirmed and affirmed again. Anti-LGBTQ slurs. And so that was on the flip side, those are the challenges that people were facing increasingly. And that sense of hostility, which I think for many was new. Um, those are kind of the flips of that. And then there comes the like bread and butter that often comes up when you talk about cannabis, any side of work really, is, wages. I think I don't know if I can share screen, but I can show a little bit of an image of it. Second. Let's see. Um, well, just it's here. The average wage is about 1950 in terms of like what we saw, which isn't like the lowest wage. And so pretty stable wages, and that's across unregulated sector. One of the things that probably is a big surprise to folks is people, I think, anticipate a wide range of experiences. We tested like violence, tested racial slurs, we tested gender slurs, we tested wages, and they were actually really consistent across the regulated and unregulated sector. So the idea that working in an unregulated job is like so much is, the labor conditions are tremendously worse. What was the most common experience that you don't get, obviously, was interactions with police, raids, and hostility from that end that came up. And we pursued that line of questions around unregulated, regulated in the interviews, and the interviews were just kind of really vastly different in terms of just, I think that it really helped us understand that along all sides, right? It has a lot to do with who you're working for. And the other piece with that is that there's a lot of change in who you're working for. Ownership is changing, and with that, the dynamics change pretty quickly. And you could be really happy in a wonderful job one day, and then the next minute they've sold the license, things change, and your entire dynamic changes. To the point where somebody was describing the entire offshoring of a delivery process to a technology company in India, and so that they were out doing deliveries and talking to call agents for guidance on where to do the delivery to and for backup, through this new company that basically had decided to outsource the entire operation. And that was just, I think, a glimpse of what we're going to see with certain consolidation trends. But I think that relation, it's just still a very much a across the board, it's all about relationships, right? It's your relationship to the people, it's your relationship to the plants, and it's your relationship to your owners and managers, which can change drastically, right? It can be really positive and like the best relationship ever. And some of those stories of like having made it through, having held on. And I think that informs some of the affinities, even in the unregulated sector, like actually getting by together and people taking care of each other. And then on the other hand, it could be really toxic, violent, and the worst forms of exploitation that mirror any other exploitative industry. So those are
Yeah,
some
it's
of the
fascinating.
big picture buckets, but
Yeah, yeah. I think it's super interesting given the rhetoric often around the unlicensed market and the unique kinds of harms that one imagines exist only there. But then to discover that good and bad employers and employment situations exist across those lines. And I really heard you that the really unique harm that comes from operating the unlicensed market isn't any intrinsic quality of the unlicensed operators and workers, but is a quality of police interactions. I think that's really, really important to emphasize. And you mentioned it a little bit as an aside about the sessions. And I've been like really curious and watching as a fellow researcher about some of these like community engaged methodologies. It's been really exciting to see some of this, and I wasn't able to make it to any, but I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about like the formation of the sessions and also your general approach to kind of community engagement throughout the project, and what kind of strengths you saw in it. And of course, what challenges arose by doing that? Because
Yeah.
it is taking on a lot in order to engage and to really work with and through community rather than doing kind of a top-down analysis that's divorced from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And diving into that, I really want to just again underscore how much this work is indebted to the team of people who made it happen because one of whom's on this call. So shout out to Victoria, and then also to our community partners, the UFCW locals, Maribel Mackenzie's here, and Felicia Carvajal, the Social Impact Center. All of those informed kind of the overall approach. And no, going into it, yeah, we had an idea it was going to take a little bit of time, and part of it was like bureaucratic logistics, but it was worth it in the sense of we found a really good home for it, and a home that at the UCLA Labor Center where they have kind of specialized in building community collaborative approaches to worker data that both does through this research justice model, the idea of which is that you by co-creating research, co-owning research, you
Weird.
eliminate the
Wow.
exploitation, but also open up the opportunity to actually put it into action in both immediate ways and then long-term ways. And so this seemed like the right place to do it, especially because going to hearings and watching the process of making policy and seeing just every time how often the emphasis was either on consumer protection or on owner pathways to equity, which is really important, or just ownership gripes around tax or anything like that, and very little about workers. That it was like really necessary to create an intervention that would both create data and equip people to actually bring that data out into the world. So the idea was through the board, this advisory board model, we were able to kind of come up with a general set of ideas and questions that we wanted to cover in the survey, build that survey together through multiple engagements, and then vet the questions. And then by that time, we were able to hire 20 worker researchers. And we decided to do that in a little bit of a different way. Normally, we hire folks, the UCLA Labor Center has hired folks through the partners themselves. But because we're dealing with the unregulated sector, because a sector where there isn't that much unionization, we wanted to make sure to get a reach of folks who worked across industries, across sectors, and had a different range of experiences so that they could practically contribute their knowledge, ideas, and vision of what this could be, and then also reach those networks because part of this is a practical question. How are we actually going to reach people? And in an industry rooted in trust because of all of the policing and criminalization and all the things, then you have to have trusted messengers and folks working with you. So we built that, and I think from there, like I just didn't fully grasp how much like amazing creativity and ingenuity people would bring into the outreach process. One of the first things we did was like set up an Instagram because that's where most cannabis conversations happen since it's banned on most other platforms, where we started to do conversations online around these issues and led by the worker researchers who would interview somebody, different people in the field. And it's a really fun process of doing that work. And then just getting out to like every event possible around the state. We covered more than 500 events in the matter of like a year and a half of doing outreach, and focused first on a one-on-one model of doing the survey where we wanted to actually have a conversation with the person. Because one, like these days when you do put a survey online, you're just going to get a lot of bots who respond to it or like scams. But two, because this was also an organizing project, one about building relationships and networks that could then be developed upon. So, and that eventually led to the question of how, once we were finally through that, and it was a long process, I'm not going to lie, we were counting surveys week by week. We were out there, we were sometimes hitting up the same people and they couldn't take it again. And so we had to really, make sure that we reached deeper, and we were doing at some point, we were doing store to store outreach, and just like a level of intense engagement. Again, one of the people who made that happen is on this call. So much props to Victoria. And Uh, and then we wanted to think about like, how do we get the real feedback on this and make sure that it makes sense. And so the idea with the sessions was go out to the community to share the data back in a way that makes sense to people, in a way that's not super boring, frankly, and that allows people to react in different modalities. And so again, all credit to the ingenuity of the team that made those happen, because what they designed was basically an interactive walkthrough exhibit where you just come in and initially you see posters of the data to kind of get ideas of. It was like video guided, self-guided. The next kind of stage was kind of dependent on the space and the arrangement, but the next idea was getting a chance to think about more behind the scenes qualitative things and kind of a mock dispensary setup. And then these jars where you could invest money where you saw the most important needs for the community. So you got a stack of cash, fake cash. I was in question whether it was fake or not. We had to reiterate it was fake cash. Drop it in the jars, kind of like the tip jar at a dispensary on where you wanted to see investment. Spaces to write your ideas about one thing you want everybody to know about the industry. Spaces to give direct feedback because we had folks positioned throughout at just different stages and part of it. And then a closing sesh, space to smoke and hang out and talk, which is the best way you get information in this industry. And those conversations went on, we had to close them down on some of them. And it really depended on the place. Some of them were packed houses, some of them were smaller churnouts, partially based, speaking to us about local dynamics, trust, and things like that. But so that was one of the challenges. Like ultimately, while we were a statewide team, many of us, because of the size of the industry in LA and Southern California, we had our deepest networks here. And we found that like breaking through, particularly to find and connect with folks in the Emerald Triangle around those sessions was really challenging. Partially because, you know, we're this outside team from UCLA just rolling in. And yeah, we had local contacts and things like that, but it's a different dynamic and there's a lot of local dynamics that we have to account for. And so, yeah, that was one of the learnings. And I think the challenge of coordination, because we were living, through Zoom a lot of the time. We started this in 2021 and just keeping that going. But I think, again, people really motivated each other to some extent through connecting with each other, through finding commonality in our training sessions. And yeah. And I wish my one major wish was that I wish we could have gathered in person much more so that everyone could actually really meet, because when we got to do that at the last stage, it was just really powerful.
Yeah, if only we lived in a state like Delaware or something, where everyone's an hour away max, right? I hear that. And just to get, maybe you said this, I think in bits and pieces, but just to get you to brag for a second, like, can you just talk about the scale of this project and just briefly give me some like contours of the counties and regions you covered, the parts of the supply chain you covered, the total numbers of interviews of data collection kind of moments you had?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We reached 1,111 workers for the survey portion. More than the first, about like 700 or so were one-on-one conversations, and then we allowed the remainder to be done through online. But we were made sure to have a point of contact, a conversation with every person who took it online, again, to avoid that. And then we followed up with more than 50 in-depth interviews. And this covered workers from the Emerald Triangle down to San Diego. And we had targets based on, we used whatever existing legal network data and some skimming of the data on unregulated shops to get a sense of density. And so we had targets around that. And so we were able to meet our goals so that we would have a sense that it was roughly corresponding to the density of the area of business. As you know, retail went the quickest, cultivation we involved the most follow-up because you can't just walk up to a cultivation site. And we focused on retail, cultivation, and delivery. We did have conversations in the sessions with manufacturing workers, testing lab folks, and things like that, that sparked ideas and hopes. But we wanted to really make sure that we covered these two largest sectors. And so, more than like almost 70% of the folks we talked to were between 25 and 39, so relatively younger workers. We had a kind of about 40% of the folks we talked to were identified as Latinx, 23% Black, 32% white, non-Hispanic, and probably an even split, 49% women, 47% men, and about 5 to 6% gender non-conforming, and a
Well,
good chunk,
yeah,
23%
thanks.
queer, LGBTQIA.
Cool.
Yeah.
Um, Great. So yeah, I just wanted to make a note. I have a few more kind of questions about some specific items. And then we're going to move on to Q&A, I think around 12:40, give like 20 minutes for Rob to engage with some questions. And then so if you want to write them in the chat, feel free. And we'll take those questions first. And then I think there's a hand raise function. So if people want to also raise their hands, then we'll take those after the written questions. So one question I had was about the labor peace agreements. That it's required, I think, last I checked, for 10 employees or more. And it's a unique requirement placed on cannabis operators. So I'm wondering how you assess those agreements and think about like whether they're helping or hindering employment relations overall.
Yeah. So this is like, yeah, a unique requirement that I think has been used in other, like maybe construction sectors and things like that occasionally. And so it was based off of that. And it came out of the fact that, again, unionization efforts were well underway before Prop 64. And so the idea was that this would both meet the needs that, if there were like strikes or disruptive activities, that they would somehow disrupt the supply chain, but also an opening to unionization. And really, it depends on so most employers, in my experience, talking in my prior work, a lot to employers, talking constantly to employers. I don't just talk to workers. Many of them had treated the LPA as just this paper they had to sign. That was just like, okay, well, find me a union, I'll sign up with them. And then it really has depended on the capacity of the unions to follow up. And it's basically an open door to actually like engage with workers and to also have a sense of who is, where people's like employment size is actually at, because it's not always reported. And so it helps, I think, unions assess like what are the bigger firms where we can reach the most people. So I think from a unionization perspective, which I will say when it comes to where we did have an ease with seeing like different stratification in data, was a union difference in wages, a union difference in relationships with a sense that you actually had a process to actually engage with a grievance process. Because many folks, we had a whole section on what happened if you had a complaint and did anything happen about it, were you retaliated against? And, folks with union at least had a process, and some of them were successful in engaging with that. So, so if we think about it from the perspective of labor peace agreement has opened the door to more unionization, and through that open the door to better wages, better results, I think that it's a overall win. Many people, one thing that happened that was reported on was that there were a lot of fake unions created. There were unions that were like what are called company unions, shell companies, things like that, that people signed LPAs with that then had to re-sign the LPA because once the DCC just didn't, know which was what, or didn't attend to that necessarily until people start reporting on it. So that's one thing that came up, but I think overall it has, and I don't think that, I mean, at least in my experience, I haven't seen it approached with that much hostility, because I think many people just didn't anticipate much follow-up. And at the end of the day, the folks are going to find out about union one way or the other. So it's like if you could fight it or you could not. And at least there's some, ability to open that door now.
Well, thank you. Um, Well, I have a few more questions, and then if folks either want to write in or they can raise their hand, and I'll recognize, and then you can unmute. But one question I had, and I think if you raise your hand, it'll jump to the top of my screen. So apologies if it doesn't, but I'll check in a second. Um, One question, I'm out right now. I'm doing field work. I'm in a hotel in Lodi, um, and uh, I'm. Uh, I've been, I work a lot around the cultivation side of things. One thing that I know has been difficult for farmers to navigate is that there's pretty significant land and site improvements that are required, somewhat uniquely as far as cannabis is concerned as agricultural, can we just say? Um, that other agricultural pursuits don't require, meaning that if you have more than I think two employees, essentially, there's a number of other kinds of requirements that you need to kind of upgrade your site to meet, often to commercial standard, even though many of these cultivation sites, in fact, I pretty much say all of them are not really commercial facilities. So what I've seen happen is it seems like there's creating a donut hole. Either you're a really small producer who doesn't have to hire anybody and basically internalizes all the labor to yourself and to your family system often, or you're a large cultivator that can hire and kind of work at scale. So the types of investments you make actually are maybe averaged out over the scale that you have are much lower. So then there's this big chunk in the middle that kind of can't make it with employees and oftentimes then has to go outside of the regulated market in order to even just have help, often skirting rules. And so I'm just wondering how you think about those rules. I mean, and whether it's good to be an exception to agricultural rules or bad, or like, because I know it's not a dream life necessarily, being a farm worker, although California is better than most other states, I'll say that much. But so yeah, I wonder if this came up and how you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it came up in that question of like who your owner is and and for cultivation workers, many of them, working in larger enterprises, were dealing with um, all kinds of issues regarding like the actual questions of how they were getting safety training and things like that. I think looking at their experiences in cultivation, many of them um, one of the things that came up were that um, while they are spending to meet these needs of all of the, really complex construction requirements and things like that, where they aren't spending anything on in cultivation is training and safety and actual hazard protections. So if folks talked about missing and damaged and protective equipment, too few employees to handle the workload safely, unsafe exposure to chemicals and mold, right? And so where the emphasis has been placed on the kind of end product of mold and things like that, where the emphasis placed on the consumer. And there's like this gap between somehow focusing on the built environment over obsessively to the point of, like you said, drowning people out, keeping them off, and then leaving what happens somehow in that middle space in total limbo. And not limbo, I mean in total disarray. And for many people, especially working in larger, because many of these folks are, to your point, that's where we have the larger numbers in terms of firm size within cultivation, because they're more consolidated, larger enterprises, and they're not working in like family farm or cooperative. And those who were having like decent experiences, but a lot of struggles maintaining their work and were working multiple jobs, right? The
Hmm.
other thing too that happens, right, is that many people were working either temp or part-time in a cultivation and then working in retail also. So working for a large enterprise, holding that job, not getting enough out of any of those jobs to make full ends meet because this is California. And then just kind of being cycled into some of that part-time labor within the cultivation field, right? So it felt like where the investment, where the onus is not on actually the process itself and making sure the process is safe for workers, the training is there for workers. And that was like a huge demand among cultivation workers in particular.
Thanks. That's really instructive. Um, I have a question here from Maribel McKinsey. And Maribel, if you want to unmute and chime in, but I'll just read what you wrote. But labor peace agreements have opened the doors for more unions. But like you mentioned, there are lots of fake unions still out there. Is there going to be anything that we can do if the shops are not engaging or getting back to the union in regards to providing the workers information and also allowing the union to speak to the workers after a labor peace agreement's been signed?
Yeah, that's a great point. Many unions will ghost. I mean, not unions, many employers will ghost or make it, still basically violate those terms, right? And so we did this process of trying to understand like potential recommendations from from workers, from organizations, from policymakers, and those will be a big part of it. That was part of what we really vetted in that conversation. And I think there's two pathways to dealing with this situation. One is that one of the things that supposedly, when you talk to regulators, is supposed to deal with these hiccups, deal with it in between, is the relicensing process. So in that key moment, it is an important time in which, workers feel like they should have a say in whether somebody gets relicensed, or at least this is an opportunity to raise grievances. If, many local jurisdictions set up this process for local input and things like that. And workers should be encouraged to be part of that. Unions should be encouraged, especially if they are dealing with these issues with LPAs. The other piece is how do we broaden like worker education in general and like more expansive opportunities to actually train and engage with workers. And what role can DCC play in that? And what role can more community-based worker institutions? Being in California, one of the benefits, like you said, is one of the ways in which we've tried to overcome the shortcomings of agricultural law in general and worker safety laws and training and worker enforcement in general is this model of worker-driven enforcement. So working with worker centers, working with local community organizations to actually engage workers in the enforcement process, because many of folks also reported they're reporting grievances, they're reporting these things to agencies that are understaffed and have no capacity to actually respond to workers' needs. So a worker-driven model of enforcement that California has piloted in other spaces is really critical in cannabis. And there you have workers who are motivated because, again, not only they love people to plant, but they also want this to be their future. They want to actually save the elements of this industry that matter to them. And so engaging them, finding the most modalities to engage them through union efforts, through worker-driven enforcement efforts, through larger public education campaigns, to actually break through and let people know about, one, their rights to join a union, but also, their baseline rights around, safety and all of these things. Because also workers, across the board workers, if you ask them beyond wages, what do folks want more of? They want more training. They want more training around medical needs and how to actually serve those medical needs. And they want more training about advanced cultivation techniques. So those are inroads into also worker empowerment and worker enforcement.
That's cool. One question we had was also around dispensaries and the local application process, and how that relates to employee benefits, like and social equity, such as providing a living wage, offering the trainings, some of which you're addressing, the fringe benefits to employees. And they often will make these kinds of promises in order to win a permit in competitive, in a competition. But however, in some instances, those same operators then fail to deliver on those promises or are bought out by other businesses, like you were saying, this turnover where the employment situation can suddenly just reverse all of a sudden. So can you comment on like if and how this kind of thing came up about these kind of agreements, local agreements, and whether or not that was or how they played out?
Yeah, that's an issue that, even with in Los Angeles, there were all these equity requirements around hiring more folks locally, hiring folks impacted by the criminal legal system, which one thing that we found, another big finding that it was that a lot of folks reported not having um, an actual like criminal record or criminal legal experiences. And so many of those folks are still being shut out of the legal industry. And then other folks who did work in the unregulated sector, others reported being like openly discriminated against because of their record actually within the legal industry. So that's one thing that many places have promised and also are failing to deliver on, right? And we, at the Social Impact Center, we did a report a few years ago on like even just the community liaisons that people are failing to deliver on. So it comes back to that question of who is equipped to actually deal with that, right? Is it in the re-permitting process, actually like helping people measure up to the promises they made? And what do you do when those people changed and the new people don't care? And many new people who buy out, particularly social equity businesses, don't care. And are large investment networks, and that's the point of our other project. But the other thing is like, how do you again equip people at the most grassroots to actually do something about it? Because if you continue to rely on agencies to do that enforcement, one, it's like a dynamic that is just creates more and more hostilities, but also it's like people just need the education, the empowerment, the ability to actually respond to those things on the ground and have something done about it. So I think that has been the thing. And the potential with unionization and what always brings it back is like, what does that contract comprise of? Can you actually integrate those into the contract so that there's some actual stake behind it, right? Because this next step from empowerment for many people is actual union and a contract. And increasingly, union contracts are expansive. They include, issues around gender, race, and violence. They include issues around, equity. And so can those become part of union contracts? And some contracts do include those. But yeah, so that's another option for actually like enforcing that doesn't rely on yet another set of requirements that are never going to be necessarily met or rely, will change because a union contract doesn't change with the employer.
Right,
That
right.
has to stay. And that was an amazing finding when we saw the very first wave of equity businesses being bought out and that would become MedMen and all these other folks is that actually they were able to keep like a baseline within these venture capitalist owned firms.
Mm. Yeah. Maybe that dovetails with the next question. But again, an invitation if anyone wants to raise their hand or write a comment in the chat, feel free. But what that brings to mind is, the importance of the contract, the importance of unions, importance of workers kind of in having some consistency in the cannabis industry as far as these standards go, that maybe regulatory agencies don't need to take it all on, in the ways that the way that legalizations happen, I think kind of, you know, trends towards that. But I'm wondering, and maybe this is, maybe, I mean, you've said it in bits and pieces, but I'd love for you to just say, front and forward, what do you see as the value of workers' voices in broader conversations about the cannabis market and the policy landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that if you really want to understand how all of the regulations, all of the ideas that California's lawmakers, community stakeholders, people interested in cannabis, owner operators all came together or whatever patchwork we've got in regulation, you want to understand how that actually works in practice. Workers will tell you because they live it every day and they are responsible really for implementing every single one of those things whether or not they're given the tools to or not, whether they're given the tools to deal with work to the realities of safety and creating a safe and equitable supply chain, they're the ones who are ultimately doing it with whatever equipment they're given. And many of them want to do it better. And so they are your best agent in actually changing that because their first thought isn't what's my line, my budget, what's the like increasing, it's how am I going to actually realize this and do my job better because I do care about no cannabis worker, and this may be just a really broad generalization, but I can tell you 99% chance most cannabis workers do not want to sell dirty weed or whatever is being the next, the moral panic of the day. That's not what they're trying to do, but they don't have the capacity, equipment, or they're not being given the tools to do that. And so they're your best chance too of realizing your public health goals, your equity goals, and things like that. And so that voice is really important. And also just something that has just come up really critically in conversations with equity owners, with communities at the ground, is that they still hold on to the principle, many workers still hold on to the principles and learnings from the medical market and the reality that this is not just a recreational consumer market that operates like any other thing. We're not talking about beer here. We're talking about something that's a real medicine for people. And so many folks see that because whether or not it's been drummed out by their owner operators or whatever, they're still getting people coming up and asking about how do I manage HIV AIDS symptoms? How do I deal with, this? And they want to know more and they can do more. So I think it's really important because they maintain that they are the lifeline to that legacy market in other ways that isn't just through the operators, that is the actual lived experience with patients. And with the plant itself, which is a complex plant that also can't be reduced to a couple of particles or turned into a pill magically. So I think that they have an appreciation for that and a willingness to actually fight for that. And one of the things that always compels me is that we're constantly, I'm in so many spaces and foundations are throwing money about like, what's a good job? How do we save good jobs? And it's the 21st century in the age of AI. Here's a good job that people love and and California lawmakers want to create good job pathways. So invest and support the people doing that. And here's already a place where people have already unionized. Like you don't have to recreate the wheel in cannabis. You're not starting from zero. There's so much value in that. But instead, the story that gets out there is the dirty weed story, which is important, but it's not the full picture, right? It's the story of, cartel panics. It's all of these things that miss that point, or the story of the taxes are too high. Obviously, the taxes are too high for sure, and we want to create more opportunities for workers, but to understand where it all comes together, it's through those relationships with workers, and their voice matters for helping actually create solutions because many of them also don't want to put their employer out of business. They're like, I get it. I'm not interested in that. I want that. So they can help bridge, I think, so many of these pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exciting and really powerful to hear. I want to like record that and play it for folks. Um, yeah, so thank you, Minaka. That was the next question, is if you could share a little bit about the research you're currently working on and that you'd like to share with us. And the question was specifically about the work on monopoly and anti-competitive practices.
Yeah. So that, working with Michael, working with Dr. Dolores Scoop, Jesse Goldstein, and other folks, and then thinking about it in conversation with people who've done this research globally. One of the things that the angle from the entry point from the worker angle is right. So we can set these things up locally and we can set up really thriving and worker ecosystems. But one thing that we're starting to see is again the consolidation behind the scenes. We've seen it in the social equity space just in Los Angeles alone. Many people had to sell. The investors are increasingly a tight network of people. And while there may be a couple, very prevalent owners, behind the scenes, their hands are tied up by these financiers and investors, many of whom have no care in the world about what happens to these workers. And in fact, are coming from other industries that really don't care, like the agricultural space, banking, and things like that, where they're more interested. I think one thing that's come up is this question of even they're really interested in surveilling workers, right? And so how is that impacting people's daily life, right? So what we're trying to understand is like, what are the realities of ownership in California, and how does that tie to national and global networks? Because also as we head to federal legalization, as more places globally come online with legal recreational markets, then we're seeing the same trends where people are anticipating US investors deciding to offshore production and things like that to avoid exactly this, paying higher wages, sustaining an ecosystem, right? So that also begs the question of like, what can we do ahead of the curve, both to share information across borders, but also locally? Like, are there things that could never be taken away by a corporate entity like worker-owned cooperatives, like these small-scale farms that can at least find ways to survive in what will be an eventually global market? And what can we like practically do to engage on that? So I think those are the questions that will come through that, but that's where we're kind of headed in the global picture. But one of my hopes is that through this global network too, we also get to, through building these community-based research teams, to connect workers globally and share their experiences. Because there are a lot of connections at that level that can be super generative and come up with ideas we haven't even yet thought of.
Sure. Yeah. Um, two last small questions is I'm hoping you can tell folks when you report you expect it to be published and where people can find it. And also, can you share more about the convening event in January?
Yeah, so the convening event will be Equity and Workers Summit put on by one of hopefully it's very initial, so I can't share the name of the state center doing it, but they're helping us plan this event that will bring up kind of key emerging industries, cannabis, not emerging, but like critical industries to California, including cannabis, green technology, and other spaces, and be an opportunity to share about what on like new research on that that's community driven, and engage policymakers around like an actual strategy for supporting these vehicles for economic development for California. So that's will be towards the end of January. So roughly by mid-January, we hope to release the report as well as like some, really practical tools around it, infographics, film, like short videos that help tell some of that story. It's a really large project with a lot of angles, so we're going to release a kind of central report and then some briefs that follow up on different angles like training, and other pathways. And so right now we're at the last stages where we're just making sure to vet everything with all of our community partners, and finalizing the writing. And also just moving past this news cycle so that in January we can start fresh with that.
Cool. Um, Thank you so much. And
Yeah.
thank you everyone that's joined us. This has been, yeah, always interesting. But Dr. Chlala, thank you for taking the time to share this research with us, speak to the audience. It was great having you.
Thank
And
you.
also, I want to thank you to everyone who is here and to consider joining us on November 1st for a discussion with Dr. Olena Sambuchi from UC Davis, who's going to be talking on legal cannabis prices and the economic impacts of regulations. We're also going to be having a webinar that very same day on European cannabis policy. For those in California, it's going to be an early morning at, I think, 6:30 a.m. Uh, but because a lot of the folks are from Europe. But there's a link tree in the chat. Hopefully it's coming to register for those events. And you can also sign up for our newsletter by using the QR code that's on the screen right now. It's on the left-hand side of the screen. So we're going to leave this page up for a few minutes so people can link as you need. But again, thanks, Rob, for everything. And to everyone else, have a great weekend. See you next time.
Thanks so much for this opportunity and the conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks.